Hello, I am Gretchen Costner, the Director of the Waldensian Heritage Museum for over 14 years now. And today with me is the Reverend Dr. Kevin Frederick, who has been the pastor of the Waldensian Presbyterian Church since 2007. We are in the church section of the beautiful Waldensian Heritage Museum. And in normal times, we would be preparing for our busiest day of the year, the Waldensian Glorious Return Festival. This year, we are not in normal times due to the COVID-19 pandemic that appeared earlier this year. So we are recognizing this event in other ways. Today, I will be asking Reverend Kevin Frederick to reflect over the past years as pastor of WPC and his involvement with the museum with a series of questions. So to begin, what attracted you to apply for the pastor position at Waldensian Presbyterian Church in the summer of 2007?
Prior to coming here, I had served as an associate pastor for 22 years and had considered myself a career associate. But I was the associate up at Black Mountain prior to coming here from 2000 to 2007, and several of the members there said, "We think your gifts need to be used in a different way," and encouraged me to apply for the position of a pastor, head of staff position in a church. And when I was looking around, several doors were opened, others closed. But this was the one that attracted me the most because of its interest in its long history going back to the Waldensian roots. And as I explored that history, I realized that this is something that feels like a call to me. And I've pursued that call in the summer of 2007. And that was a very good beginning for me. This has been the most joyful and satisfying ministry period in my 35 years of ministry.
What do you think caused you to take such an interest in the Waldensian history that resulted in 2 historically based sermons each year and the development of an eventual book on the subject of the Waldensian history?
The Waldensian history is 850 years long, starting in 1178. And when you consider that, that existed, the Waldensians were in existence 350 years prior to the Reformation. And yet, within Christianity and Reformed Christianity, only gets a footnote. Oftentimes just a brief mention in a seminary course about the Waldensians. And yet I found when I came here that there is so much to that history. John Blaynot, who had served this church as the church historian and had grown up in this church as a Waldensian, indicated to me that there were 33 separate persecutions that the Waldensians had incurred over the course of their 850 years, and drew those persecutions up through the 19th century. As I explored the history myself, I realized there was one additional persecution in the 20th century during World War II, when the Nazis had their base in northern Italy as the Allies were advancing up the Italian peninsula. The Nazis were burning and destroying villages of Waldensians as they retreated. There was resistance to the to the Nazis from the Waldensians in that period of time. And as I explored that, I realized this is something that there's a lot of dimension to this history that people just don't know. So I felt it was my call as a pastor of this church to inform the congregation about the broad perspective of its history. As I got into it, I realized there were several prominent names: Louis XIV, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, John Milton, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Benito Mussolini, and many other lesser names, less prominent names, that had major impact on the Waldensian history over the course of its 850 years. The more I got into it, the more interested I became, and decided that this was something that I would like to develop a series of sermons on. And as I worked on those sermons, I realized from comments people made as they were leaving church on Sundays after I had preached that this needed to be in book form. So I developed a book that gives a broad overview of the Waldensians from their origins all the way up through the Pope Francis apology to the Waldensians in 2015, which was another historical event of great importance. In 850 years, there had not been an official apology for the persecutions of the Waldensians by the Roman Catholics. And so when this happened in 2015, it also marked a time in which the Roman Catholic Church recognized the legitimacy of the Waldensian Church and its role within Christianity, and that was the first time that had ever occurred.
What do you think you have accomplished in the last 13 years as a pastor and educator of the Waldensian community?
As it applies to the Waldensians, certainly when you think about the routines of life and the seasons of a church year, one of the accomplishments has been just the pastoral leadership of guiding a church through its annual events every year. But as it applies to the Waldensians in particular, two things. One is the integration of the Waldensians with the Presbyterian tradition. And the second most important thing, I think, which may itself be the most important thing, is a recognition that there is a Waldensian history, but there's also a Waldensian faith story. And so it has been important for me to be able to communicate that history as a faith story and integrate the faith of the Waldensian people into an understanding of this broad range of 850 years of history. That has taken a little bit more effort and time to develop, and as I have worked on that, I spent about 5 or 6 years of reading Waldensian history and then developing the individual sermons that would develop its history, and also integrate the importance of the faith within that history. And so I think those are the two things that are most important. The second of those two, the integration of the Waldensian with the Presbyterian. The Waldensians joined the Reformed Church in 1532. And from that point forward, they were connected with Geneva, Switzerland. And John Calvin did not come there until 1540 or 1542. So they preceded John Calvin and his influence in Switzerland and Geneva. But they were very much influenced by the Presbyterian Reformed tradition because they had been interpreting the Bible literally prior to the Reformation, and the Reformed Christians were able to help them understand that there are different ways of interpreting Scripture and applying those to a variety of different passages, so that the truth behind the Scripture is revealed in a more dynamic way rather than just simply a literal interpretation of the Bible.
Your ministry here has involved consistent visitations in homes of congregational members. What are some of the important things you learned about the early Waldensian settlement here in Valdez from your visits with these older members?
Many of the folks that were still alive when I got here, and there probably have been 70 Waldensian members who had grown up in this church, who have died over the last 13 years. And when you, in conversation with many of those individuals while they were still vibrant in their activities and in their thinking about their history, they shared with me the very difficult days of the first years of the settlement. And during those days, there were 2 droughts that occurred the first year and the second year that complicated their lives. But they came here literally with some pocket change in their pockets, and that's about all the money that they had. So they were so destitute that in the first few weeks of being here, they sent out women to go and sing to different Christian communities and churches, and trying to raise money so that they would have enough money to build a Waldensian bread oven, which was so important to their survival. And that really shows just how destitute they were financially when they arrived. The hardships of those first several years, they actually had sent some of their children up to New York to become employed by wealthy individuals up there, working in their homes as servants in the homes, and those children then sent money back to the community to help keep it alive. Because of the difficulty in growing crops those first 2 years, and in addition to that, they also were trying to develop a sawmill and cut down the lumber that was very heavily forested in this area. And yet, it was such a very difficult process for a small group of men to do this, and they didn't get along with each other on the work site, and there wasn't a natural leader to come out of that process in the first few years. So the sawmill did not work as effectively and efficiently as it could have. But they also realized that in order to turn the amount of volume of trees into lumber, and then the bark into tannin, would have required a lot more labor than what they had available for them. So those difficult first years, they hung on. Had it not been for the generosity and support of local individuals in the community, and particularly the Presbyterians in this area. Now, how did the Presbyterians become interested and involved with them? 2 years after arriving here, the Waldensians joined the Presbyterian Church U.S., which was a former Southern Presbyterian denomination in the United States. And they were part of a presbytery called Concord Presbytery. Their pastor, Reverend Soulier, ended up going and speaking to in presbytery meetings about the desperate straits of the Waldensians, who were literally hand to mouth feeding themselves with just a small, meager amount of food. And Dr. Boyd, who was the pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church of Charlotte, ended up taking a personal interest and organizing the Presbyterians in the Charlotte area to raise money and food and clothing and supplies for the Waldensian community here, and was the lifeline for this church for the first several years of its existence. These were stories that I learned from these Waldensian members of this church who were second and third generation Waldensians. They had learned them from their parents who had grown up in this church, but their parents, their grandparents, had been the actual first settlers, and in some cases their very parents had been the first settlers here. So hearing these stories and realizing the frugality of the Waldensians as they came into this community, living hand to mouth, meant they had to be very careful with their finances. They had to work very hard in order to build beyond the base in which they had when they first came. And then they were able to develop industry and through their hard work. And as a church community, though, it was really interesting to me that the first several generations, they were pretty much focused in on themselves. And it was only in the 60s and 70s and on forward that they started reaching out and becoming more integrated within the Valdese community by inviting new members in who were non-Waldensian. And over a period of time, the generosity of spirit that was here when I first came towards serving Valdese and serving the people of Western North Carolina and really the world through our mission emphases was further developed as time has gone by. And that's been an area which has been an important part of the ministry that's happened in the 13 years I've been here, is the outreach to the local community by vastly expanding our pantry and by finding new ways to serve beyond ourselves.
You have conducted the memorial services of several dozen individuals who were second and third generation Waldensians. Some of them were the last Italian-born Waldensians of our congregation. What legacy have they left for this community of faith?
There are three individuals that were members of this church when I first arrived who have died since I've come here, who all three were Italian-born Waldensian. And the first of those is Gus Traun. Gus was very influential here in this museum, working with Gretchen during his retirement in very important ways to develop some of the overview of the history of the Waldensian people here and throughout their 850 years. But Gus grew up in the Italian valleys, the Cottian Alps, at a time prior to World War II. And when the war broke out, Gus was 17 years of age. By the time he was 18, he was conscripted into the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. And Gus, rather than go that route, became a resistance fighter and worked with the resistance over the next 3 years. And during that period of time, was very much involved in the resistant movement of northern Italy. When Gus moved here in 1946, he did not know anybody, and except for one connection, I think his father had been the pastor in this church, and so he knew the names of one or two individuals, and they introduced him, and quickly he was integrated into this community of faith. The second individual was Robert Michelin. Robert came to the United States in the late 1930s and worked at West Point for a period of time as a waiter and served George Marshall and several other prominent individuals in U.S. military history at that point in time as a waiter in their restaurant. Then he moved south here and became a member of this church after marrying his wife Eleanor, who also was Waldensian. The third individual was Enos Durand, and Enos was born in Italy, but then moved here as a child and was related to Naomi Ralston, and I believe they were first cousins. Enos was in her mid-90s, early 90s when I came here, and died at right at age 100. She was very actively involved in this church for a period of years, but with her death, 126 years of members of this church being born Waldensian, but in the valleys, that period of time ended. And so now we live in a time in which everyone in this church is either a descendant or a Presbyterian who's come to this congregation and joined this community of faith. And so we are living after the period of time in which the Waldensians that were born in Italy were part of this congregation. That first group of individuals that have pretty much all died by now, the second and third generation Waldensians, really brought to this church a commitment to its ministry at a level that is changing rapidly as time goes by. The leaders of this church, when I first got here, were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now the baby boomers are have replaced those individuals, and the leadership that group had provided in the volunteer hours, as well as their dedication financially to the life of this church, is changing. And we are looking now to baby boomers to be the leaders in this church and beginning to develop younger adults into the life and ministry of this congregation. And yet we realize with the passage of this previous generation that things are going to change, and we're looking at a time of change with the interest level and dedication of its younger members to the church.
This weekend is the glorious return, the very reason for the festival in August every year. What is the meaning behind this historical event that the Valdez community celebrates every year in August?
As I mentioned earlier, there were 33 separate persecutions that the Waldensians had been impacted by, most often coming from the Roman Catholic Church, although France also, and the Duke of Savoy, who was their leader, also played roles down through history in persecuting the Waldensian community. The 17th century was probably the worst century for the Waldensians. In the 1620s, there was a period of 2 to 3 years of a drought, and starvation had impacted many of the lives of the Waldensians at that point. Towards the end of that decade, in 1630, they experienced a pandemic, not unlike the one we are experiencing today, only it was a Black Plague. And that pandemic killed many, many hundreds of individuals in the Waldensian valleys. Each of the valleys had lost a number of its leaders and its members, and including 12 of the 14 pastors that served those valleys. If you go up through the 17th century to 1655, that was a year called the Easter Massacre, in which the French troops came in and with the intention of destroying every man, woman, and child in the Waldensian valleys. Many of those individuals escaped and moved on to Geneva, Switzerland for a period of time and then returned to the valleys. 1686 was the next major persecution, and here Louis XIV, the King of France, and the Duke of Savoy joined forces to again completely annihilate all of the Waldensians in the valleys. There was a small band of individuals called the Invincibles. These were men who did not simply surrender their lives and their weapons to the invaders, but actually became guerrilla fighters. 12,000 Waldensians were then imprisoned. Of that group, more than 8,500 of them in a period of 6 months died in prison because the conditions were so terrible and they were either starving to death or dying from terrible disease and other forms of waterborne illness. The Invincibles were able to make a deal with the King of France. They parlayed the citizens that were still alive. At this point, there were about 3,000 Waldensians still alive in the prisons. And the King of France agreed to release them in the fall of 1686. But the timing of their release was in January of 1687, and they were to go, as part of the agreement, all the way through the mountains to Geneva, Switzerland, crossing 10 major mountain ranges on foot without adequate, many of them were already near starvation to begin with, and they didn't have adequate clothing in the middle of an alpine winter. More than 850 of those individuals died during that period of their exile, so that around 2,000 Waldensians arrived in Geneva, Switzerland in January of 1687. The next 2 years, they rebuilt their lives and were supported by the Genevan community because of their Reformed roots and their support from the Christian community in Geneva. In the summer of 1689, there were 900 Waldensians and Huguenots who decided to leave the valleys or leave Geneva and return to the valleys to retake their homeland. Before they even started their journey, more than 250 of those individuals were captured by the French troops and were imprisoned and put into galleys, French galleys, as slaves. This meant about 600 left the confines of Geneva and headed back into the valleys. Then a portion of those individuals on the way back into the valleys, who every time they encountered French troops had to fight their way back home, a portion of them died. Others were left abandoned because they could not keep up with the relentless pace of returning to their homelands. And then about 200 of those individuals also went back to the Huguenot valleys in France because they were Huguenots and not Waldensian. This meant that less than 400 individuals had actually returned in September of 1689, and they went to Cibod, which was their place in which the leaders of the Waldensians, the captains of their troops, made an agreement. It was the first time in history where military leaders considered themselves equal to their troops, and they came up with a covenant of Sabbat, which is an important historical document to these days. Then they realized that the best place that they could go was a place that was most defensible, was one that John Avell had told them about, and it was in Basilia. And at Basilia they went on top of a mountain, and if you look at that mountain from down below, and I have been there to see this, it actually looks like there are four outcrops of rocks that are jutting off of this mountain. And they are called the Quattrodenta, which are the four teeth. And this is where the Waldensians garrisoned themselves and positioned themselves to defend their existence against 16,000 French troops. And the French were in the valleys below, and were, in that fall of that year, there were several assaults made on these Waldensian troops, and they repelled them. Less than 400 men repelled them repeatedly throughout the fall. Then the winter, the Alpine winter came in November, and the French troops garrisoned themselves in the town of Pinerolo, where they stayed in winter quarters throughout the winter. They returned in April, and this time brought an additional group of about 5,000 Savoyard troops. So you had a group of 20,000+ troops that were surrounding the base of the mountain where the Waldensians, less than 400 strong, were stationed and garrisoned on top of that mountain. During that winter, though, there was they were about ready to run out of food in late January and early February. One of the amazing things, and they attributed it to the presence of God supporting them in this period of time, was a winter thaw. And in February of that year, the winds blew in and thawed the valleys, and they went through the Waldensian valleys during that period of time and found that there were crops underneath the snows that they were able to harvest those crops and bring them back and put them into service of the Waldensian men who were stationed on that mountain. And that helped them to survive all the way through May. In late April, when the French troops came back with the Savoyard troops, they began their spring offensive, and several assaults were made on that mountain again, and the Waldensians effectively repelled them. At this point, there were 347 Waldensian men surviving from not only the winter, but also these repeated assaults. On the night of May 12th, the French had garrisoned 5,000 of their troops in the mountains, all surrounding the location of where the Waldensians were. And they were ready the very next day to assault the Waldensians, and had even brought in gallows on the back of wagons that were stationed in the valley below, and the Waldensians could look down and see these gallows with nooses hanging down from the gallows, and they were ready to kill every single Waldensian survivor that they took prisoner. This would have completely eliminated the Waldensian presence in the valleys at that time. That night, Henry Arnold, who had been not only their pastor, but also had been a captain under William of Orange in years prior to becoming a pastor of the Waldensians, he had some military experience, and he had guided them through this whole period of time. And on the night before, he preached to them. And it was from Psalm 68, which is an important psalm for the Waldensians. And during that period of time, that evening, a fog rolled in over the whole region, which was a very dense fog. There was one captain who had grown up in Basilia, who was with them on that mountainside, and said, I can lead you off this mountain, and if we work our way through the French troops that are down below, we can find our way to safety. This captain guided the entire force, 347 men, down the mountainside, literally hand to shoulder, and on their knees as they crawled their way on a steep precipice down through the valley and through the garrison of the French troops that were in the valley below, and guided them all the way to safety, to where the next morning the French troops looked up on the ridge and they saw 5 miles away the Waldensians heading back to their home valleys, and they had escaped certain death that very day and were able to live to see another day. Interestingly enough, just a month later, the Duke of Savoy switched sides and joined the Protestant forces against the King of France and asked the Waldensians to become part of his troops, and they switched their loyalties again to the Duke of Savoy, who was their sovereign ruler, and were able to repopulate the valleys with their people who were exiled. And yet, the interesting thing about that period of time, one other footnote, is that 10 years later, the Duke of Savoy realigned himself with the French troops, and the King of France gave him the Chisone Valley, which is a valley that is in the northern part of the Waldensian valleys, and there were about 3,000 individuals that were living in that valley who were Waldensian descendants. And part of the gift of the Chisone Valley from the King of France to the Duke of Savoy was the requirement that all those who were native-born Waldensians had to be exiled yet once again. And one more time, the Waldensians who were living in that valley had to be exiled to Germany. And this time, they ended up settling a portion of Germany. So this whole period of time, 1689, is the time of the glorious return, and a time of great history, where not only do we see their resolve, but we also see God's guiding hand to help keep them safe and guide them to safety after what was appearing to be their certain demise in the morning of May 13, 1690.
What are some of your best memories related to Waldensian events over the last 13 years?
There are many. When I think about the last 13 years, as I mentioned earlier, the seasons of life in a congregation, the importance of twice a year having the Waldensian special services in February and in August each year have been really important for me. I've looked forward to those. I've tried to present an angle on history that has not been not normally known by a lot of people. And it was interesting to, earlier on, when some of that second generation Waldensian was still alive, that generation was still alive, I found that it was very gratifying to hear some of them at the door say, "You told me something about my history I didn't even know." And to hear that occasionally was very meaningful. Celebrating baptisms and weddings and funerals, to lift up a life of an individual that was well lived and to do it with an entire community of faith, those are really important and special moments for me. Even though they are grief-filled, they still are celebrations of life. One of the early baptisms that I did in this church was with a descendant of a Waldensian and his family, and they requested of me to use some water that came off of their property, and I did not realize at the time, but that was evidently something that many of the original settlers here would request water from their property be used in the baptism of their child. And it was just a way of integrating another dimension of the history and the traditions of this church. When I think about some of the most joyful moments were during the 2018 125th anniversary year of this church and community. We had developed for a period of 2 years prior to that a planning team that looked at a number of different ways for us to celebrate that special 125th year. In addition to that, I was writing the book, With Their Backs Against the Mountains, 850 Years of Waldensian Witness. And so having that year full of celebrations from February all the way through December of that year, including the first ever homecoming this church had, was a time that will always live as very special in my mind. As I said, the Waldensian Church, Presbyterian Church, has been the church I've grown closest to. I've given more of myself to and received more of the life of this community as a gift to me. And so it's been a wonderful 13 years in celebration together with each other.
And lastly, what are some of your hopes and dreams for the church and museum in the coming years?
Well, let me start with the museum. When I came here, there was a group of about 20 individuals who were on the historical committee for the museum. Many of those individuals are no longer with us. And so the core leadership of carrying out the many duties of the museums is not just a matter of what Gretchen does. It's also reliant upon a lot of volunteers, both as docents, as archivists, and so many of those individuals are no longer with us. So the challenge that I see is for the museum to be able to draw not only from members of the Waldensian Presbyterian Church, but also from those with Waldensian roots, or even individuals who believe in the Waldensian witness here in this community and are interested enough in that history to be part of the museum's operations. We're at a transitional time in the life of the museum, and I think trying to figure out whether this should be run and governed by a group of volunteers from the community, or should this all be organized by the church. These are the questions that we are currently actively facing and coming up with some answers for. As I look to the future of Waldensian Presbyterian Church. The church has a tremendously strong basis and foundation to build upon. Not only 125 years of dedication to this community and the building of this community and its serving of its people, but also the longevity of its history that's 850 years deep. Both are deeply valued by this congregation. And so, as a source of strength, I think that's what it builds upon as it's looking to its future. One of the things that attracts me so much to the Waldensians is more of a philosophical point of view. The Waldensians believed in the portions of Scripture that were focused upon doing faith rather than articulating faith. In other words, there's more an emphasis on what's called the praxis of ministry, the practice of Christian faith, rather than on the doctrinal portions of Scripture found in Romans and many other of the epistles that come after the Gospels. So the Waldensians, as doers of the faith, that was something that was very attractive to me, both historically and as we live our lives. It's an integration both of the foundational beliefs that we have as Reformed Christians, which is so important, but realizing that it's in how we live that faith every day that is the most important thing. And the Waldensians, as we're looking as Waldensian Presbyterians to our future, we, in this next 10 years, are at a critical point in the life of this church. We have in this county the coming of the School of Math and Sciences, which is the second satellite unit of an academic campus in the state of North Carolina for high school students. And this is attracting a number of individuals who will come here as professors. And I would hope that the church in the next 3 to 4 years really builds upon its selling points and develops what those selling points are for the future of this church. It has a lot going for it. We involve our children in the life of ministry actively every Sunday in this community of faith. And so the role of educating our children, I think, would be very attractive to people that are coming to make Morganton and Valdez their home base of operations as servants of the School of Math and Sciences. And with that School of Math and Sciences will also come new high-tech industries. And again, Valdez needs to be prepared to receive these individuals as a town, but the church needs to be prepared to welcome these individuals as folks that are looking to grow their spiritual lives and their faith. And the Waldensian tradition of being a progressive form of Christianity, I believe, will be very attractive to those who are coming to the area for high-tech industry and employment here. These are great opportunities, and it is in the next 10 years that is the most critical, I think, for the future of this church. When I came here in 2007, the very next year we started the 2008 wasn't a depression, but it was a time of downturn in our society financially. And so the challenge for the future is to say, these past 13 years have been a bridge from what the church used to be as a industrial leader and leader in this community, where so many of the leaders of the industries were members of this church, into a time of the future where, again, I think if we position ourselves to attract new and dynamic individuals, but serving the entire community and welcoming Hispanics, African Americans, whomever wants to come and be part of this community of faith, there is a place for them in this church. That's my hope, and I think the legacy for this church, for its future, comes out of the strengths of its present. Thank you very much. Looking backwards now, as we've come through this last 13 years together, again, I'm struck by the fact that the Waldensian story is not really all that well known in the larger Christian community. And so I think I would hope that in the future that the Waldensian Museum becomes a place where people can learn that story as it has been this past 13 years. A place where people can continue to find the relevance of the Waldensian history to the broader Christian witness. In a way, it seems ironic that this last year of ministry would be so much focused on a pandemic, which ties the present all the way back to the 1630 pandemic of the Black Plague. And the challenge for the church during this time has been to remain relevant. And we've done that by having our worship services online, by finding creative ways to continue the ministry of the church in ways that impact people in their own homes. The Waldensian people down through history have been pushed in difficult times to make their faith relevant and continue in their witness of faith. And so I guess in a way, it seems fitting that the conclusion of a 13-year ministry would also be a time of great challenge into the life of this community of faith. I'm grateful for many things during this period of time, for a Christian Action Committee that has developed exciting and dynamic ways to have a vacation Bible school, which was so well received by not only the children but their parents in our church. I'm grateful for the ways that the outreach of the church has continued in providing even things like gift cards when we can no longer have our pantry. I'm grateful for the ways that members of this church have sustained their giving at the same level that they did prior to the coming of this pandemic. And so we're coming through this time as a strong church. We are also recognizing the importance of community, and being absent from one another has meant that we as a community of faith really value each other. And I can only imagine the very first Sunday that we're back inside the sanctuary again, and it may be after I'm gone. But during that period of time will be a time of real celebration between members of this church and the importance of the faith in each person's life. And I see that as a promise of things to come. The Waldensians lived on promise because so oftentimes the reality of their current life was unfulfilled or was facing great hardships. We live on promise today as we move into the future, and that is God's continued presence and promise for this community of faith that will remain and guide us into our future together.
I would like to thank you for joining us, and thank you, Reverend Kevin Frederick, for this interview question-answer program. We hope you have learned a lot, enjoyed this. The Waldensian Heritage Museum would invite you to visit once we do reopen, to come learn more about this heritage, see the artifacts that we have, many publications that we offer in our gift shop. We would love to have you here at Valdez, North Carolina, to share in our history. You may contact us for any information. And again, thank you for viewing, and enjoy your day.
Thank you.